Good morning,
Morning.
good afternoon, and good evening from those who are tuning in online from around the world. Welcome to the Wilson Center event on responding to the Ukrainian refugee plight with perspectives from the EU and the United States. I'm John Thornmajuk. I direct the Refugee and Forced Displacement Initiative here at the Wilson Center. The initiative aims to inform policymakers and practitioners by expanding the space for new perspectives, constructive dialogue, and sustainable solutions. Congress established the Wilson Center about 55 years ago as a living memorial to President Wilson and to be a bridge between the academic world and the world of public affairs. Since 1968, our nonpartisan mission has not changed and remains the same. The Wilson Center tackles global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform Congress, the executive branch, and the broader policy communities. We bring the world to Washington, D.C., and we bring Washington, D.C. to the world through our scholarship. Forced displacement is a defining issue of the 21st century. This reality has implications for how we talk about refugees every now and everywhere. There are over 100 million people displaced by conflict-induced crises around the world, from Myanmar to South Sudan, Afghanistan to Syria, Venezuela to now Ukraine, and more. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the UN Refugee Agency estimates that there are nearly 15 million Ukrainians displaced from their homes. Majority of them have crossed the border as refugees. Despite the challenges of the initial response, EU countries and their allies responded with unprecedented solidarity by providing emergency aid and warm hospitality to the refugees from Ukraine. But lived experience shows that as the war drags on, as it is now, it prolongs the duration of exile and raises important questions, such as what should be done in the medium and long term to support refugee livelihoods beyond the basic needs. From the initial response to the current humanitarian operations, what lesson can the international community and other regions learn to inform refugee policy and programming? Where is the silver lining? Today's speakers will bring their perspectives and experience to address these questions as they discuss the state of humanitarian response to refugee plight, role of various stakeholders in addressing the urgent and long-term needs, and lessons learned for future refugee programs. Speakers will start with opening remarks, followed by a moderated discussion, and if we have time, Q&A from the audience. On behalf of our President and CEO, Ambassador Mark Green, and on my behalf, I welcome you to the Wilson Center, and thank you for joining us as we dive into this event. To introduce our esteemed speakers and moderate the event, I now invite my colleague, Robin Quinville, who is the Director of Global Europe Program here at the Wilson Center. Robin, take it away.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I also want to welcome you to the Wilson Center. I'm reminded that President Wilson was president during a time of war and changing borders and refugees and displaced people. So it is all the more important that we are looking and examining how we can respond to today's challenges on that subject here at the Wilson Center. I'm going to quickly introduce our three speakers with one caveat, and that is that we are going to have Congressman Connolly speak first. He will have to leave us quickly. That is because the nation's business does not wait, and he needs to be back on the Hill. Representative Connolly illustrates the close links between the Wilson Center and Congress. In his seventh congressional term, he is an expert on foreign policy and refugee issues. That's because he was also the executive director for the U.S. Committee on Refugees and Immigrants. We especially appreciate his participation because his time is limited. So right after I introduce the other two speakers, Congressman Connolly, you'll speak, and we'll have a couple of questions between us. He'll be followed by Dr. Michael Kohler, the European Commission's Acting Director General for European Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid Operations. He brings exceptional experience on this issue to our discussion today. He coordinates worldwide EU humanitarian aid activities, and we are just delighted that you could be here from Europe today. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce my State Department colleague, Ambassador Julieta Valls-Noyes, Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. Ambassador Noyes brings to the job extensive experience in crisis management and human rights. And I hope she won't mind if I point out that her parents came to the United States from Cuba as refugees themselves. So, Congressman Connolly, you have the floor.
Thank you. And if you don't mind, I'm going to stay with the panel here. It's great to be with you, and great to be with the Wilson Center again. Woodrow Wilson was a very consequential figure, not only in the United States, but on the world stage. And we can draw a lot of lessons from Woodrow Wilson. I mean, he was an idealist and sometimes substituted what he wanted the world to look like for what the world, in fact, did look like. And kind of a tragic story, obviously, that in imposing those ideals, everything came crashing down. Very little of what he wanted to accomplish, in fact, got accomplished in the peace talks that he attended. He was the first president actually to leave the United States and go overseas for an extended period of time. And of course, the coup de grace was that the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the treaty that created the epitome of what Woodrow Wilson believed could provide international machinery to provide permanent peace, the League of Nations. And we never joined. And one wonders how history might have been different had we. He was a man of staunch principles who was increasingly convinced of the certitude of his own positions. And I think that there's a lesson there, too, because that's okay, but if you don't work with others who don't share your view or your politics, you can lose everything. And he, unfortunately, was unbending about the treaty and the League of Nations, and ultimately Henry Cabot Lodge was only too happy to accommodate him in defeating the treaty. It was a sad ending for a very promising president whose first term was very progressive and really changed the face of America to this very day. There are lessons from that, I think, in terms of the current situation we face in Ukraine and in Europe. I've spent a number of years in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, which is the legislative arm of NATO. In the last 2 years, I've served as president of all 30 parliaments, members of NATO, and 12 partner countries, including Ukraine. And what I've seen over the years about Russia and Putin was what I call magical thinking. The Putin we want to explain away, the Putin would prefer to see rather than the Putin who exists. And you saw that very much present when Putin illegally occupied and annexed Crimea. In the 21st century, we had a leader in Europe who decided that he was going to solve disputes and make claims through the use of force. something we thought would put an end to in the 20th century. And a tepid, anemic response to that has led directly to what we are now seeing in Ukraine. A depraved, reckless, brutal, violent, without compunction Russian invasion and attempted annexation again of someone else's sovereign territory. But when he made this invasion last February, scales fell from European eyes, and for that matter here in the United States for many people as well. Putin really was this thug, this threat, this sociopathic figure willing to kill anybody at any time in the pursuit of his own delusionary view of a Russia-centric region that to the point where he actually denies Ukrainian identity. Ironically, everything he set out to do has backfired. You want to deny Ukrainian identity. Ukrainians identify as Ukrainian more than ever before in their history. You want to fracture Western solidarity. You have contributed to unprecedented solidarity in the West and a very forceful response by the West. You want to contain NATO. Well, there are two new members at the doorstep, Sweden and Finland, ready to join. And frankly, it's going to be the West is going to be a lot less concerned about provoking Russia as we look at new membership for NATO as we move forward, because he's done his worst. So he has no leverage. You want to show the strength of Russia, this 10-foot-tall military. And in fact, you've shown that Russia has a corrupt, weak, incompetent, inefficient military that is not 10 foot tall, but is more like 2.5 feet tall, and is suffering egregious casualties at the hands of these people you don't even want to recognize as independent, national, sovereign people, Ukrainian. The response of the West has been initially very calibrated. So when we looked at the situation, say, after the war began and through March and April of last year, there were strict limits on military equipment that would be provided, even things like drones. So if you remember, in the early days, Turkish drones rather than U.S. drones were used because we didn't want sophisticated electronics falling into the hands of the Russians. And we were concerned about how capable would the Ukrainians be in handling sophisticated Western technology. And what we learned was the Ukrainians were more than capable of handling sophisticated Western technology, were highly adaptable, both on the field and in strategizing, and were able to stop the Russian invasion of Kyiv and, over time, roll back Russian progress both in the east and the south. The humanitarian situation followed the military situation. Over 17 million Ukrainians became refugees at some point in this time period. Now, more than half have returned home, but it is one of the most fluid refugee situations I can ever remember. I mean, normally we have long-term refugee situations like Syria. People always want to go home when it's safe. But in the case of Ukraine, people are kind of going back and forth. Huge numbers of refugees crossed into neighboring countries, but particularly Poland. And I was at the border, the Polish-Ukrainian border, on March 5th, right after the war began. And I was stunned by the Polish response. I talked to border guards in Poland, Polish border guards, whose families had taken in Ukrainian refugees. Imagine a United States border guard saying, we're taking in refugees, my own family. But they were. They opened their homes. They were placing huge numbers of refugees within 24 or 48 hours. People were not stuck in shelters. And most of them were going to private homes. The Polish response, humanitarian response, was extraordinary and set a model for other countries, including our own. We've taken in about 100,000, I believe, through our program, and maybe more to come. Most Ukrainians are not looking for permanent resettlement. They want to go home. So we're not looking at situations like Cuban refugees or go way back, the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. A lot of those folks understood when they left Hungary, they were at risk if they returned, and they were probably going to start life over in other places, including here in the United States. Not so in the Ukrainian situation. And in that time period, the United States response has also expanded. Congress has provided $113 billion and counting in Ukrainian relief, humanitarian relief, military relief, economic relief. That is probably the largest single response to a single situation in another country, not involving us directly, in American history. It's an extraordinary response and has made an extraordinary difference in Ukraine on the battlefield and in trying to repair damage and to allow for return of refugees. That assistance is life-saving and critical. And we need to make sure that the coalition of support for that ongoing assistance, both here in the United States and among our allies in the West, remains strong, and that solidarity remain constant and steadfast. And I believe both are true. There are dissonant voices. Well, we've given too much, and we don't want to give a blank check. And well, no one's arguing a blank check. And with respect to giving too much, I don't know. How much is enough? The goal is to force Russia to deal with the fact that what they are about in Ukraine will not succeed. This isn't just about geography, and it isn't just about Ukraine. It is truly a conflict between an authoritarian, autocratic, violent, brutal, depraved regime that seeks to impose its view of the world on others by force, and the survival, in fact, the success of Western liberal democratic values and systems of governance. And when the West is solidified, we are a powerful entity. If you look at the NATO alliance, it wasn't that long ago people talked about NATO being obsolete. And I've reminded my European friends about a big difference between this war and Putin's behavior and 1939 when Hitler acted with impunity in Europe. You know the big difference? NATO boundaries. For all of his bluster and threatening, Putin has dared not cross a NATO border. He'd like to. He'd like to cross the Baltic borders. That would be easy, actually. He'd like to cross the Polish border, which is providing, that's the transshipment point for much of the equipment going into Ukraine. He certainly attacked Lviv in the western part of Ukraine as a warning to Poland, which has been ignored. But he has dared not cross a NATO border. That's the power of NATO. That is the power of Article 5. That is the power of solidarity. And that power prevents him from spreading that war. It allows us to concentrate on responding in Ukraine. And it is a symbol, I think, of the fact that all of this intellectual speculation about the future of liberal democracy is being tested as we speak, and we're meeting that test. So the stakes in Ukraine are humanitarian. And we have to always remember what it means when we talk about Ukrainian refugees, as it does when we talk about refugees anywhere at any time. It means human suffering. It means enormous pain. It means family separations and all that flows from that. These are human beings. When I went to the border, and I straddled the border in Poland and Ukraine in early March of last year, what struck me was, first of all the refugees were young women with children and older women. There were no men, because all of the men up to a pretty advanced age were expected to return to fight. And they did. Unlike Russia, with Putin's mobilization, Ukrainian men weren't fleeing as refugees or seeking asylum in other countries to avoid serving their country. They readily donned camouflage, took their weapons, and took the fight to the streets. But meanwhile, their loved ones were separated from them, not knowing what that future would be for him or for them, but hoping it was temporary. It was cold. It was really cold. And most of these refugees initially crossing the border in the thousands, tens of thousands, and there were several cross-border areas affected. The one I was at that day had 24,000 people cross the border that one day. There were 4 or 5 other crossings. They were disoriented. When planes on the Polish side, right, flew over, not military planes, just ordinary aircraft, almost to a person, the young women with children started ducking down and looking up fearfully, because they had just gone through strafing and bombing where they came from, wherever they came from in Ukraine. You could see the fear palpably on their faces and in their body expressions. And you realized again, these aren't nameless refugees. These are real people who are experiencing extraordinary pain and suffering in the 21st century in Europe. And, I was with a bipartisan delegation, and every single member of that delegation, Republican or Democrat, had the same reaction and came back with the same resolve that we will not let this succeed. We will help those people. We will partner with them until we force Russia to rescind this special military operation and withdraw from Ukrainian territory and make reparation, because the reconstruction of Ukraine is going to be an enormous challenge for all of us. And the primary entity responsible for the destruction must also be a primary entity in helping to rebuild and making restitution. Woodrow Wilson had to deal with that at the Paris peace negotiations, where confiscatory reparations were being demanded by France and others, but particularly France, of Germany. And by going too far, which actually Wilson didn't really want to do, but he acquiesced, we helped lead the way, pave the path for something even worse. So we have to be mindful of that as we think about the future. But meanwhile, we have a task to complete. And I can tell you that in both Congress and among our allies, periodically, I guess, reporters have to make a living, so they write stories about, is there Ukraine fatigue? So long as there are Russian soldiers killing Ukrainians and attempting to seize territory illegally in Ukraine, there will be no fatigue. And we will stay by their side until this task is successfully completed and liberal democracy prevails and shows its strength. Thank you for having me here today. God bless.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So if you have time for one follow-up question from me,
I'll take two.
Oh, all right. Well, I'm going to.
I wish I could take more, but they scheduled a hearing at exactly this time, so I wanted to keep my commitment to be with you today, but I do have to get back to the committee for that hearing. I'm sorry.
Time is the most precious thing politicians have, so we are grateful for the time that you give us. Thank you very much. So first, I'd just like to note that this is the first time that a country has become the #1 recipient of U.S. assistance since the Marshall Plan. How sustainable is that assistance? And then my follow-up question will go to that.
Well, nothing's forever. When I look at colleagues on the other side of the aisle with whom I've worked on this issue, they are steadfast. They're not going to waver. So, we have strong support from the incoming chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Mike Turner, of Ohio. We have the solid support of the incoming chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, in which I serve, Mike McCall. We have the steadfast support of the incoming chairman of the Armed Services. So I think in key positions on the Republican side, they're not going to waver. Now, there's a fringe far-right element that, Steve Bannon has articulated. He used to say it's absurd that we have subscribed to Article 5. Are we really going to go to war over Estonia? That would be the far-right example that I always love to use. Are we going to... And what Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and Article 5 is not triggered, but the threat of Article 5 in protecting NATO borders and in making it clear Putin can't cross those borders without real consequences. And if you look at what we're doing, what more do you need from us to persuade you dare not do that? And the answer to Estonia is yes, because Article 5 is real. It's and hopefully we've clarified your thinking, Vladimir, on that. So I think we've met a lot of tests that for a lot of people were abstract or theoretical, and I think the critique on the far right is muted because of the carnage we see every day in Ukraine.
You have stressed the bipartisan nature of that support, and you are the expert on that. But I'm going to ask you a difficult question. Scale of 1 to 10, how do you believe that support will be sustained, say, a year from now?
I believe it will be sustained. I mean, could there be erosion in some quarters? Yeah. Could there be, second guessing? Yeah. But that's kind of natural in any ongoing conflict, right? So let's go back to the American Civil War. If you read, you go to 1862, and Lincoln's got his hands full, and all kinds of people are questioning, why are we in this war, and how do we win it, and what do you mean you want to free slaves and make the war about slavery as opposed to restoring the Union, and I didn't sign up for that, and I mean, a mess. And you could have written a story or an analysis if you took that moment in time and said, this is not going well, and there's no way we're going to restore the Union, and Lincoln's going to be lucky to survive his term because the consensus has fallen apart. Except it didn't. It was part of the process. It was part of the dialectic necessary to maybe reform or reaffirm the consensus that no, we need to proceed. I believe what's happening in Ukraine, and I give Zelensky great credit. He's become a figure in the world stage who is a heroic figure and has the capacity in many, many cultures and audiences to rally people to this cause. He's done it with the U.S. Congress when he spoke before a joint session. He's done it at NATO. He's done it at the United Nations. He's done it in various parliaments in Europe and around the world. So he's brought to the table a necessary element that didn't exist before, which helps crystallize and even personalize the struggle in a way that makes it easier for people to go, oh, I'm with him. And especially in contrast to such an unsympathetic figure as Vladimir Putin. So, okay, your choice is, Volodymyr Zelensky or Vladimir Putin. Who do you choose? And I think that things like that actually can make a difference in holding together the coalition. So I would predict a year from now, if the war is still going on, we're going to be united and solidified. There may be more voices calling for maybe it's time to negotiate, and that always sounds attractive. Why wouldn't you want to do that? But what are the grounds for such a negotiation? If the grounds are Vladimir Putin's preconditions, they're unacceptable. There's nothing to negotiate. We're not going to negotiate away Ukraine's sovereignty. We're not going to allow him to hold on to territory he's gained illegally and forcibly and brutally through violence. We're not going to require Ukraine to give up its right to determine its own self identity and determination. If Ukraine wants to be a member of the EU, if Ukraine wants to be integrated to the West rather than the East, if Ukraine wants ultimately to join NATO, we're not going to be party to saying, no, you can't do that. So I think there have to be more military setbacks for Russia to help clarify their thinking, to create an environment that could be fertile for a negotiated end to this situation. But I'm more sympathetic to Zelensky's point of view, but that negotiated end has to result in the full restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty, including Crimea.
Congressman, thank you so much for taking the questions. I can see your staff is actually growling at me. So I'm
Invite me back. Thanks so much. Thank you for doing this. And hello to everyone streaming.
Thank you. Dr. Köhler, what we've heard from the Congressman is also a real appreciation for the work that has been going on within the EU to respond to this, and really the measures have been extraordinary. So I'm going to turn the floor over to you and ask you to give us a few remarks.
Thank you very much, Robin. And while the Congressman still is in the room, let me just express from a European point of view our deep gratitude and admiration for the American effort.
I just want to know you agree with me 100%.
150, but whatever I don't agree with, I will only come to once you have left the room. Right. No, but let me first say thank you very much for having me here. I've been coming often to Washington over the past 25 years, but I never made it to the Wilson Center.
How is that
this big omission on my CV had to be addressed, and I'm most grateful that with your good efforts, this is the case. And you see how nervous I am.
No. Here, take mine.
No. It's everything's in order. No, but indeed, you just heard the figures about U.S. assistance to Ukraine. Actually, we should not forget Moldova, which is part of the equation as well. But these figures that the Congressman just advanced, basically, in my understanding, cover basically the entirety of U.S. assistance, including military assistance.
Yes.
Now, therefore, I think one has to be clear, so to say, when you compare figures of U.S. assistance with figures of European assistance, so forth, that you don't compare apples and pears. But also, if I look at the European contribution to this crisis, which is not even 1 year old, actually, by our own standards, the figures are, let's say, very, very impressive. I don't want to bombard you with figures and statistics, which anyway, enter the ear here and get out there. But it is quite impressive. If you just look at 2022, And I'm not only speaking about the EU budget, not about the budget of our 27 member states, but only, so to say, what Brussels is handling directly. We have made available about 7.2 billion in soft loans, 4 billion of euros. So add 9 or 10%, then you come to the amount in dollars. $7.2 billion in macro-financial assistance. If we add what the European banks, like the European Investment Bank, have added to this, you come to a much higher figure, 11.6 billion euros. We have made available 620 million euros of budget support. These are grants. Of course, we have used basically all our financial instruments and financial and political instruments. There's not a single department in the European Commission that would not in one way or another contribute to helping Ukraine, inside Ukraine, but also, of course, Ukrainian refugees inside the European Union. Now, I don't want to bother you with all that. I mean, I could probably speak for about a couple of hours about that, but I would like to concentrate a little bit more on what my own department is doing. DG ECHO, an acronym you may have heard, but of course may not be on your daily kind of plate, so to say. DG ECHO is actually one of the 3 big humanitarian aid agencies in the world. After United States, if you take USAID and the State Department together, and German humanitarian aid. Actually, we're doing 2 things, DG ECHO. We're doing humanitarian aid, but we're also doing civil protection. So if you want to compare us with the US setup, you would have to combine the humanitarian part of USAID, BPRM, and actually FEMA. On the civil protection side, protecting our people against the natural disasters. And actually, as it so happens, we have used both tools, the humanitarian and the civil protection tool, to the full in this new crisis. And I think we're all quite impressed not only by the challenges, but also how quickly the system was able to gear up to the challenges. Had we met here precisely a year ago, probably wouldn't have discussed Ukraine. But had we met here, I would have told you, yes, Ukraine is indeed one of the about 80 crises where DG ECHO is active, because like our colleagues from the United States side, we are a global donor. We are in Mali, we are in Venezuela, we are in Myanmar, we are in the Philippines, we are in Somalia, we're everywhere. And so we were also in Ukraine. At that time, we had about the 25 to 28 million euros program in the separatist areas, so in Lugansk and Donetsk in the east of Ukraine, trying to ensure basic social services for the Ukrainian citizens living there under separatist rule, or to be more precise, Russian occupation. Now, that dramatically changed, of course, on the 24th of February. And today, we have, once again, only the figures for last year, we have mobilized about 523 million euros in grant money for humanitarian aid for Ukraine and Moldova. And we have mobilized the same amount of money for in-kind deliveries under our civil protection scheme for Ukraine. Now, let me explain a little bit how that works. Humanitarian aid, obviously, like in the United States, is guided by a number of principles of impartiality, principle of neutrality, principle of humanity, non-discrimination, and so forth. We implement our humanitarian aid in the same way the United States is implementing it. We are delivering through the United Nations agencies, through the Red Cross family, through international NGOs, or sometimes local NGOs, and also partly through member state specialized agencies, like, for example, development aid agencies that also are active on the side of humanitarian aid. Now, a year ago, I said we had 25 million, and it was only in the eastern parts, or the easternmost parts of Ukraine. Today, we're working all over the country with a program that is about, 2,000% bigger than what we had at the beginning of the year. And actually, what are we addressing? And actually, I could distribute to you a kind of leaflet that we have on that. We are working mainly in areas such as winterization, so preparing displaced persons for the winter. We're still in the middle of winter in Ukraine, obviously. This means, for example, blankets. It means heated tents, containers, and so forth. This is a major issue. But the second big issue, and there we concentrate, of course, on the more or less 6 million, a little bit less than 6 million IDPs that are in Ukraine. The second biggest issue is indeed cash, multi-purpose cash. Cash to buy food, cash to, let's say, address basic humanitarian needs every day. So what we are doing, especially when it comes to food security, is we are rather distributing cash or smart cards than distributing in-kind food aid, because markets are functioning in Ukraine. Imports and exports are happening inter alia through our Solidarity Lanes initiatives. And people can purchase what they need once they have cash. But obviously, many IDPs don't have cash any longer because they are not working. Actually, 40% of the IDPs are children, are minors at school age. As the congressman said, many households are actually women-led because men are at the front, for example. So there is a particular vulnerability. So we address this with cash. Together with this comes another big focus of our operations, which is protection. Mm-hmm. Protection in legal terms, protection against gender-based violence, against any kind of abuse, not only in sexual terms, but also, for example, when it comes to organ trading, when it comes to all kinds of murky businesses, and particularly weak, of course, are people with disabilities, handicapped people, sorry. And obviously, healthcare comes together with that. Big issue has become psychosocial support, helping traumatized persons, in particular children, but not only children, of course, who, as the congressman so eloquently illustrated, basically have been suffering, are traumatized in a psychological way after all these bomb attacks and bombings that they have gone through. As so many of the people in need are children, education is very important. Education means two things. People need to be schooled. There needs to be education in emergencies, and we are regularly in all over the world. We reserve about 10% of our budget for education in emergencies. So we do the same thing in Ukraine. But there's an additional problem. The additional problem is that, of course, as millions of children have been displaced, they are far away from their schools. Where they may not be able to go to school because the next school is far away, inter alia because many schools actually are being used to host the refugees. So there's a problem, a very, very simple problem with school busing. So we were asked by the Ukrainians to provide school buses, and now we're collecting school buses all over Europe. We are now at, I think, about 140 or so that we have delivered already, and there are many, many more to come. Some that we are purchasing with EU money, others that are being donated. So we're delivering all this. Water and sanitation is another matter, is another area. So I could give you the figures now on how many million people are benefiting from that. 9 million people, for example, food security, again 9 million health-related support, 7 million water access, 6 million benefiting from protection, and so forth and so forth. It is a huge operation. But it is not the only huge operation, because obviously, by all means, the figures are staggering, but they're not unique. They're not unique. About 2 weeks ago, I was in Addis Ababa and had talks with the African Union. And they asked me, they had full understanding for the complexity of the situation in Ukraine, but still they said, why are you Europeans so fixated on Ukraine? Because on the African continent, we have about 17 Ukraines. Mm. And at first I said, well, listen, you cannot really compare that. But then, thinking about it, it is true. You have a number of crises in the world, not only in the African continent. For example, think of Myanmar. In Myanmar, you have exactly the same number of people, 17 million people, who are in need of humanitarian aid. They are not as displaced as in Ukraine. There is a lot of violence, 13 armed conflicts in Myanmar, for example, but still it's not totally comparable with what we are seeing in Ukraine. But still, it must not be overlooked that there are many areas in the world that are suffering in perhaps not a comparable way, but in a sizable way, and that also, where also we need to address the needs. And therefore, I'm very proud to say, actually, that when I say that about 523 million were mobilized already last year, and we're coming to similar figures this year under our humanitarian aid system, this has been done without, let's say, dragging any kind of fund, any dollar, any euro away from any other crisis situation in the world. Mm. So these 523 are actually fresh money that we were able to mobilize from general reserves of the European budget that were not foreseen to be used for humanitarian purposes. And actually at the same time, we have record levels of European funding, for example, in Yemen, for example, in Afghanistan, and many, many other crises. The challenge will be to sustain this kind of effort, to maintain this once we go in the second and third and the fourth year of the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. I'll come back to that in a second. ECHO, I said, is working basically with two sets of instruments. or as I sometimes say, we're working on two legs. One is the humanitarian one, the other one is the civil protection leg. Civil protection is also very interesting. It follows totally different tools and instruments and principles than humanitarian aid. We have the so-called EU Union Civil Protection Mechanism. That is a mechanism which organizes kind of disaster-related solidarity between the 27 member states of the European Union, but also 8 other countries. Those other countries that are not EU member states are countries such as Turkey, Norway, Serbia, Iceland. Recently, Albania and Bosnia-Herzegovina have joined, and actually Ukraine and Moldova have just applied for membership in this mechanism. Any country in the world can apply for assistance under this mechanism. Even the United States have done so in the past. If that happens, we have, a center in our Director General, the Emergency Response Coordination Center, which is kind of a crisis room that operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that receives calls for assistance from all over the world. We used it, for example, at a large scale during the Pakistani floods in last autumn. And then, when a government, and the Ukrainian government has made abundant, use of this facility, when a government asks for in-kind assistance, which can basically concern every single physical item that you can touch, then we are reaching out to our member states, to the 27 EU member states, the 8 participating countries on top of the member states, or we look into our own EU reserves, into our stockpiles of material, in order to check whether we can ship such material to the country that is requesting it, in this case, Ukraine. Ukraine has mobilized this mechanism about 136 times since the outbreak of the war, and they have asked basically everything that you can imagine we would be able to deliver, from potato seeds to pontoon bridges, everything. Lots of IT equipment, lots of medical equipment, and obviously with the Russian attacks against Ukrainian infrastructure, what becomes very, very topical right now is support in the energy sector. So with this mechanism, we have already shipped, at the cost of the EU taxpayer, about 1,440 generators into Ukraine, 1,200 transformers, about 5 million light bulbs, LED light bulbs, and about 70,000 pieces of electric repair material in order to keep the grid going. We have offered.
Dr. Köhler, if I could hold that thought for a moment, and ask Julieta to join in, and that way we see the two pieces of this assistance puzzle, what the EU is doing, but also to hear from Julieta in terms of what the U.S. is doing, and then we can have a better basis for discussion.
Could I just have one final sentence?
Absolutely.
So what I want to say, and once again, you see that my mind is overflowing, so to say. We are using all the tools that we have. The challenge will be, and I think that is something on which the US and the European Union have to come together, is how can we sustain such an effort? Because all these instruments were made for very quick, short-term impact. However, as in the case, for example, of the Syrian crisis, we now see that we are probably before a multi-annual effort that has to be sustained over many years, and the mechanism and the budgeting for the mechanism has not been made for this. So how can we switch from kind of an emergency response to sustained response, while at the same time empowering the state of Ukraine to take care of its own citizens? I think that will be the challenge for this year.
Ooh, you're identifying my actual questions, so this is absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. Julieta, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, and because I realize we just have an hour for this session, I will dispense with all of the hortatory language at the top, but just say thank you to you, Robin, to the Wilson Center, to John Ton, to Michael, to the Congressman. And then I'll just launch into what I was going to talk about substantively, which is actually I want to start off by doing something I don't usually do, and that is looking backwards. And I specifically want to look backwards to March 4th of 2022, when the EU and the member states passed their temporary protection directive, just 10 days after Putin rolled in for the second time into Ukraine. And his actions led to massive displacement not seen on the European continent since the Second World War. He was counting on Europe and the United States to be divided and not to stand up to him. And instead, he found himself confronting a united Europe, And the TPD is really, it's a shining symbol of that unity. It was the right thing to do at the right time, a milestone in EU humanitarian history, and it sent the strongest possible signal to Putin that Russia could not fracture the EU, and it threw into stark contrast the difference between European compassion and Russian aggression. It's been a model humanitarian response, Michael, and you've described some of the specifics of that, but it really has been a model by empowering refugees to be self-reliant and by bolstering and stabilizing the very generous host countries that have been welcoming them, our host communities. The U.S. commitment to Ukraine, meanwhile, I think, as the Congressman encapsulated beautifully, remains unwavering. Since February of last year, the United States has provided $1.9 billion to support the humanitarian response inside of Ukraine and in the neighboring countries. We at the State Department work closely with our colleagues at USAID to deploy and manage that funding. USAID handles the funding inside of Ukraine, and at the State Department in PRM, we handle the humanitarian response primarily to the neighbors. And I'm very proud of what we've done. It is an historically unprecedented level of support, as we've been discussing, for one country in such a short period, and we're doing heroic work. Our partners are doing heroic work under life-threatening circumstances. Just last week, for example, UNHCR was able to reach that building in Dnipro that was bombed within just hours of that bombing to try and help rescue the survivors and provide support after that devastating attack. Meanwhile, back here at home in the United States, we've worked closely with the Department of Homeland Security to stand up United for Ukraine, an innovative program enabling individuals here in the United States to sponsor Ukrainians for parole into the United States. We have welcomed more than 105,000 Ukrainians since we launched the program in 2002. Like the Congressman, I visited, my first trip as Assistant Secretary was to see the response on Ukraine. I visited the border with Moldova, not Poland, but I visited Poland as well, and I met refugees just as he did, who were coming across, describing the horrors that they had seen, including a lawyer from Odessa who was volunteering at a UNHCR facility in Chisinau, and who told us, this was just a few days after the war began, that she didn't know if her home was still there. So their heroism, their resilience moved me then, and it continues to move me. I also saw firsthand the generosity, not just of governments and of institutions, but of individuals and of entire societies helping people in need. There was a winery I visited in Moldova that is housing and employing displaced Ukrainians. The massive refugee registration efforts in Poland. There was one big building where people who are arriving from Ukraine could do a one-stop shop. They would visit, sign up for bank accounts, health insurance, register their kids for school, all under the same roof. I left with no doubt in my mind that the U.S. and European commitment to supporting displaced Ukrainians and their host communities was absolutely rock solid. But even then, people were warning that it was a honeymoon period, that this wouldn't last, that was this sustainable? Could we, did Putin's ambitions have an expiration date? And I'm here and I'm happy to say that the honeymoon continues. EU polls from last October and November show that 73% of respondents still approve of continued EU action to support Ukraine. That is really encouraging. But as we approach the one-year mark, we also have to find ways to help prevent host fatigue. We have to reduce the pressures on host communities and governments to avoid the risk of rising anti-refugee sentiment that has emerged in other protracted displacement crises. And the best way to do that is what the Congressman was saying, to focus on the true costs of Putin's war and on the costs that are being borne by the people of Ukraine. We are committed to continuing assistance. As Michael has said, the EU is, even as needs keep growing, because the impact of that violence and deprivation will last for a long time. That includes, as Michael was saying, the impact on children. UNHCR estimates that only 30% of refugee children who are eligible to enroll in host country schools have done so for in-person learning. That means 7 out of 10 Ukrainian children, 7 out of 10, are experiencing learning loss. Many could lose years of schooling, so we have to find a way of getting them enrolled and keeping them in school. Housing is another critical challenge. Ukrainians fleeing to neighboring countries have, by and large, been moved in with host families. That is not something that can last forever. Think about how you feel when you have visitors who stay more than a week at your house. Some of these visitors have been in people's homes for close to a year. So we have to find ways of helping host communities and helping the Ukrainians and finding long-term housing solutions. Like our European friends, the American people have been overwhelmingly supportive of this robust humanitarian response, and we are convinced, again, as the congressman was saying, and happy to hear the Congress feels this way, that the response has to continue. But the context for this assistance is daunting. Today is an important anniversary. It is the 2nd anniversary of the coup in Myanmar, in Burma, with the untold suffering that has resulted from that. Over 1 million people displaced over the borders of Myanmar and Bangladesh and other countries. The effects of climate change are fueling migration and displacement. All of these conflicts Michael was talking about in Africa, there really are so many needs all around the world, and so we have to get creative in our responses. So to build on what Michael and Congressman were saying about our response, I want to talk about maybe some other solutions that we can pursue within this global context of growing needs. And that is to understand that we can't do it all. National governments, international organizations can't do it all alone. So we are reaching out to countries and organizations that have not been traditional donors. We're trying to expand that donor base, trying to find new ways to get more money and more resources to respond to this crisis and to these crises. We're also looking closely at the nexus between humanitarian assistance and development assistance and trying to find ways to see if we can do economies of scale and escalating the value of our assistance when put together. We're finding new ways to engage with international financial institutions and multilateral development banks to find innovative financing models for these types of crises. The World Bank's work is an excellent example. The U.S. is a longtime supporter of the bank's Global Concessional Financing Facility and of the International Development Association's Window for Host Communities and Refugees. These are new models, new places that we can turn to for resources. And we're looking for other innovative ways to respond to crises, including ramping up our diplomacy to try and find solutions so that people can return safely, humanely, sustainably to their host countries, which at the end of the day is what most refugees really want. We're also seeing private sector organizations and companies and individuals step up to the plate in a very big way. Nearly every one of our partner organizations reported explosive growth in donations in 2022. By September of last year, the World Food Program had surpassed its 22 forecasts for private donations by 76%. So in September, 3/4 of the way through the year, they were already 76% ahead of what they had expected to get in contributions. And they were on track to more than double private contributions over 2021. Private donations to UNHCR totaled $1.27 million in 2022, with nearly 600 did I say million? I meant billion. More than 640 billion for Ukraine response alone. And early data show that the ICRC, in collaboration with the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, collected many more times private donations in 22 than in 21. We know that we can't count on these escalated levels of donations and contributions and support forever, but they are proof positive that individual private citizens and private organizations and new donors and new approaches can be game changers in the humanitarian funding space. So the lesson here is, while we can't get complacent, we also can't lose hope. Our resources are not infinite, but with creativity and innovation, we can and we must multiply their effect. So with that, I think we have a minute and a half
minute
for
and a half.
questions.
So I'm going to assume that I got 5 extra minutes or something like that on the back end of this. So I'm going to toss one question out today, because you have both talked about how your institutions are working to try to address particularly the needs of refugee children, and to try and you're focused on the fact that this is a longer term need, right? And Juliet, I especially appreciated from you, but also from you, Michael, this look at what are the mechanisms that we have and how are they working, and beyond the context also of Ukraine. Is there something that we can draw as a lessons learned from how we've responded to the Ukraine crisis that we could apply to crisis management across the board? And I think I have 2 stellar crisis managers here, so I'm going to toss that question to both of you. And I think, Michael, I'll give you the floor first.
This is a very complex question.
Well, you didn't expect easy ones, did you?
No, I love complex questions. No, but I think one has to be aware of a couple of marking differences between the Ukraine crisis and other crises of the same size, perhaps, across the world. One is that for humanitarians, it's almost never the case that you can actually work with a functioning state. The entire humanitarian system is basically made to allow aid to be delivered at a very fast pace without relying on state structures. In a way, humanitarian aid deals with state failure. And this is absolutely not the case in Ukraine. I think we're all amazed at how well the state is functioning, not only how well it is functioning, but also how big the ambition of the Ukrainian government is to take care of the needs of their own population. Mm-hmm. So they don't want us, for example, to provide extracurricular schooling. They want us to help them to, let's say, bring the educational system of Ukraine really on board. And that is one of the reasons why, and this is totally atypical, as a part of our humanitarian aid, we have a program of more than 100 million euros to repair Ukrainian school buildings. Yeah? So, I mean, this can hardly be transferred into another region. Another point which is atypical is that this is a crisis directly at our borders. So when we're speaking about temporary protection, for example, this is not about letting in somebody who comes from another hemisphere. It's about somebody who travels perhaps 50 miles or so, is then on EU soil. And what's also atypical, if you, for example, compare with the Syria crisis, is that there is not, so to say, a one-way road in the movement of people. Yes, we have welcomed about 8 million refugees from Ukraine in Europe, but many actually are going back. If you look at the, let's say, at the balance sheet right now, you see that there are more people returning from the EU into Ukraine than Ukrainians exiting Ukraine coming to the European Union. This is absolutely not the same in the case of Syria or in the case of Afghanistan. When people have left, they have left almost for good. At least they stay around for 10 years, 15 years or so. So there are differences, I think. What we can, however, learn is, first, how quickly the system was up to the task. Just imagine, I mean, there was no aid agency and no administration that was present in the center or the west or the south of Ukraine on 23 February last year. But 2 or 3 days later, they had to be there. So we had to operate a huge surge with respect to our administrative capacity, with respect to our ability to launch projects and to implement them, but also the entire logistics. What we have done for the first time in Ukraine is we have set up altogether 6 logistical hubs in Ukraine, but also in Moldova, Poland, Slovakia, and in Romania to supply goods either to the government or to Ukrainian NGOs. So this kind of logistics operations, that's something that we are rolling out now also in other countries. There we were, let's say, under the need to innovate, and this innovation actually is something which we can now mainstream in the way how we operate. And secondly, of course, donor coordination is a particular need there. We cannot rely on the traditional structures like humanitarian country teams or so, because we had to invent everything while at the same time we were doing. And there, I think we have learned a couple of lessons on how to work together also with local NGOs, not only with international NGOs, that we can perhaps replicate in other parts of the world. But I think the lessons learned mainly concern the area of how to mobilize logistics and how to combine, you alluded to that, how to combine actually state finance assistance with private sector donations. We don't have scenarios elsewhere in the world where we would have such a sizable amount of private donations.
Innovation.
You know, Michael and I talk pretty regularly, and we have been talking quite regularly in recent weeks about Afghanistan. And I think the main lesson that we have learned from our joint, as the lawyers say, jointly and severally, in the activities that we have done individually but also together in Ukraine, have taught us even more emphatically than we knew already the importance of being united, the importance of working together, the importance of complementing each other's efforts. And that is a lesson that we are learning and that we are employing right now. Everything that we've learned in Ukraine, while it's a completely different, could not be a more diametrically different context in Ukraine than in Afghanistan in terms of the capacity of the host government, the willingness of the host government to work with us and so forth. But that lesson of unity and complementarity and creativity, learning from each other and working together, is one that I think will serve us well into the future wherever humanitarian responses are needed.
Julieta, Michael, thank you so much for joining us here at the Wilson Center. I think your message of innovation and creativity, in addition to dealing with the practicalities of logistics and so forth, are truly lessons for this whole subject, and I'm glad to know that you're applying them beyond the Ukraine example and so forth. I want to thank you very much for joining us here today. I want to also thank both our in-person audience and our online audience for joining us. We have about 400 people tuning into this by virtually, and that is one of the real advantages, to be sure that we are able to have this conversation not only here in the room, but with our online audience. So thank you all for joining us. We very much appreciate it. And thank you to our speakers.